All right. Well, thank you, Jason and Leslie, for coming. I think Jen will do a general introduction to the event, and then I'll introduce you guys, and then we'll just like let you guys get into the talk.
Thanks everyone for coming. Special thank you to Leslie and Jason for being here. My name is Jen. I'm one of the co-founders of Second State Press, which is a community printmaking studio located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And tonight is part of our virtual studio visits, where we get a chance to learn a little bit more about other artist processes and have a chance to ask questions and get to know new artists a little bit more. Joanna Booth is our programming coordinator at Second State Press, who helps coordinate and organize the virtual studio visits. And she's been with Second State Press for over 2.5 years and does a lot of amazing things. And I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you, Jen. Great. Yeah, I'll just do a little bit of introduction to Jason and Leslie. JULMstudios is a collaboration between Jason Urban and Leslie Mutchler. Working in Brooklyn, their work is project-based and research intensive. They employ an art practice of pseudo-bibliology through the study of books, printing, and publishing. Their projects investigate the evolving meaning of printed matter and the sacred places print occupies, always aware of the dialogue between analog and digital technologies in our day-to-day. The pair has had a solo exhibitions at NARS Foundation, Center of Fine Print Research in Bristol, UK, Space Gallery, Atelier Séculaire, and many more. They have been awarded numerous residencies, including the Edition Basel in Basel, Switzerland, and currently in residence at the year-long Diodun papermaking workspace residency in Brooklyn. Both are affiliated with Pratt Institute, where Mutchler is chair of the foundation program, and Urban teaches publishing courses in the communication design program. So without further ado, thank you so much for coming today, and we look forward to hearing you speak.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share screen and I'm going to share sound because we've got it. I understand how to do
it. Can we make it big though?
Yes. Collaboration, everyone. Welcome. Okay. So I'm going to start us off with a land acknowledgement, just to kind of get us moving in the right direction this evening. As we gather, I'm going to ask that you join me in acknowledging the Munsee Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. We acknowledge that where we live and work and teach was actually founded upon the exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous people. And this acknowledgement for us demonstrates an offer to a way to offer recognition and respect.
So thank you, Joanna and Jen and everyone at Second State Press, everyone who came to the lecture, for inviting us to do this virtual studio visit. We have a long history with Philadelphia and we're always happy to reconnect. And since this talk is officially billed as a studio visit, and we're sorry you're not actually in our studio, that would be great. But we decided to start with some images of our current space. We occupy a second floor studio off of Flushing Avenue in Brooklyn, across the street from the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Hopefully this video gives you a little more sense. The floor itself is divided into 12 studios and each is rented by a range of, I thought I killed the sound.
It's okay.
I hope this doesn't say anything embarrassing. I thought I got rid of the sound. Yeah, the floor is divided into 12 studios and each is rented by, a range of artists and small businesses. And the first floor is used by a Chinese restaurant supply company that fills the sidewalks and street in front of our building with trucks, vans, forklifts, and pallets of food and supplies every day. The third and fourth and fifth floor house a Jewish middle school, and the sounds above us lead us to believe that they use the space above us for dodgeball and other athletics throughout the day. It's a really lively scene. We've been in the space for less than a year, and we chose it because it's about a mile from our home and less than a mile from Pratt Institute where we work. It's very convenient.
Okay, so while we use the space for fabrication, drawing, and assembly mostly, it's also a really important place for staging our work. We can hang things up on a clean white wall. We can also arrange and rearrange. It's as much a place of reflecting on work as it is a place for making work. At this moment in our studio, there are a number of handmade paperworks on the wall. You see one behind us that we haven't even started working on. We're sitting actually in our kitchen dining room in our apartment right now.
School night.
School night. But you can see these large handmade paperworks on the wall. Each sheet is about 40 by 30 inches, and they contain a marbled pattern that was added during the sheet forming process. The text is then added digitally on top of the paper printed. We draw the scale or the text out to scale with ink, scan it, and then print it on the handmade paper using a large format printer, which doesn't actually sit in our studio, but sits in our
It's right over
our
there.
apartment over here to the left of me. It's like having a couch or a large couch in the living room. This in-progress work is the result of a 2020 workspace residency that we did at Dudonné, which is a paper making workshop that most of you probably know about or are very familiar with in Brooklyn. The residency was interrupted by the pandemic, but thankfully we were able to extend our time at Dudonné into 2021. While there, we focused on a wide range of experiments, including large-scale applique sheets that were simulating a kind of embedded marbling. We generated a pretty sizable number of sheets that we're still working to complete at this time. As we worked, we began to think about these large sheets of paper as paper or printed talismans, a mix of good fortune and happenstance. Layered on top of the fluorescent yellow and pink abacus sheets is an overlay of indecipherable protection spells modified from rural folk magic. The distorted black letter text, scripted by hand and then manipulated digitally, mirrors and responds to the marbled color on the individual sheets. In their finished form, each sheet will be located within a birch box enclosure that serves as an altar to house the talisman, along with other natural and man-made offerings. And here is a second example of where these works are going.
Yeah. I mean, we're also playing around with AR and some other things, but we're not in a position to share that right now. As you've gathered by now, we're collaborators. Initially, we shared a studio to pursue our own individual works, but over time, as we exchanged more and more feedback, we found common ground and began to work together exclusively. From ideation to execution, we share in all aspects of our practice. We're equal partners in work and our life, and in some ways consider our partnership a political act in that we're modeling a co-equal approach to authorship. All of our accomplishments are shared. This is practical because we do have a 9-year-old son and jobs that take a lot of time away from the studio. But working collaboratively has allowed us to double the effort and energy for any given project, which has resulted in more ambitious and intensive goals. We share physical, but also intellectual labor and enjoy a fruitful dialogue working together. So while most artists have like an inner dialogue, we actually like have an outer dialogue where we talk and ask questions and share.
And make fun of each other.
Regularly. For most of the years that we've collaborated, we've been without a studio. We showed you some pictures of our current studio, but we tend to actually think of ourselves as post-studio, which, if we're being totally honest, is probably just a way to make studio-lessness a cool thing. Basically, after living in Austin for 9 years, we finally did build a studio. We didn't have one for a number of years. And then we decided to move to Brooklyn less than a year later. So it just didn't seem like it was meant to be. I think a lack of studio can be a problem, but it can also free you from a lot of constraints because usually we develop ideas in relation to specific opportunities. And we like to know the space, the audience, and its history as we develop work. And a studio space will inevitably dictate the terms of your practice, right? So while we're happy to have a space at the moment, we fully anticipate an eventual return to studio-lessness.
And here in this image, we're working at UNT's print press at the University of Northern Texas in Denton. as an example of studios where they're not ours, but we work together. We often find other places to work together.
It suits the theme of collaboration,
Yes.
right? We don't have a lot of photos of us together working, so we had to dig back in the archive. So we're printmakers by training. We have multiple degrees between us, but we define print really expansively. We use the word print rather than printmaking, and it's a small but kind of freeing gesture for us. On the rare occasion that we actually try to define print, we define it as expansively as possible. So rather than just specialize in one particular technique, at this point, we are definitely generalists. We hope to saying that a jack of all trades is a master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one might be true. We try to integrate multiple processes and forms into every project. We privilege no one process over another. So an etching and a Xerox of that same etching can coexist as equals. We honestly feel like we live in a crowded media moment where artists have a limitless vocabulary, and we just celebrate and embrace the plurality of choices. And I think the notion that hand inking a plate is more valid than using a desktop printer seems maybe a little naive, which kind of, I feel bad saying that in front of Evan Summer. I don't mean that, Evan. But I think as the march toward digitization continues, I think the hierarchical distinctions between types of analog print are going to just matter less and less and less, right?
You did, but it's good. We're going to start with a 2019 exhibition of ours and talk a little bit about some of our work, mostly kind of framed chronologically, but we'll bounce a little bit back and forth here, just to give you a sense of some of the work that we've done together. So what you're looking at here is an exhibition that was at Lock Haven University called Gray Mists Between Us, which was a body of work that investigated color, print, and collective memory. From this project, we began collecting images of social unrest from Time Life magazines from the 1960s and the 70s. The images were then cropped and edited to remove figures and any sort of visual anchors that might give the photographs real kind of context. What was left were gray images of residual protest and violence that could contrast with our paper, which was a subdued primary palette of pink, yellow, and light cyan. The installation of layered digital prints evoke a smoking and obscured remnant of civil strife and political tumult, at once too familiar and yet distant. The large-scale abstracted images printed on everyday office-grade bond paper also suggest ephemerality and fragility around any one generation's defining moments. It may also evoke a bureaucratic processing of revolt. Of Strange Shadows, which was an earlier version of this work, you'll notice in our work, you'll see how we work in iterations. We're constantly revising and working through series of works. This is an earlier iteration that was shown at the University of Illinois in Springfield, and it was much brighter and more colorful. The images are crisp, clear, and legible. This is before we began kind of editing them out. You can see the foreboding scenes of fire, haze, and smoke within the prints themselves. The title of the exhibition was taken from American poet Anthony Heck's 1977 book on poetry titled Millions of Strange Shadows, which wrestles with some of the tragedies of the 20th century. And in turn, Heck's choice of title was referencing Shakespeare's 53rd sonnet, which speaks to an attempt at intergenerational understanding.
So working through iteration allows us to develop and explore possibilities. Because we think of the work as research, or we define it as research, we consciously change things from installation to installation in hopes of finding new and perhaps better solutions. This is the second iteration of that same body of work. It's called Phantom Shapes and Ghost Events, and it was shown at the Center for Fine Print Research in Bristol, England. Again, between exhibitions, we overprinted the images to gray out the color and bury the imagery under layers of text, halftones, and grayscales. To continue the allusion to poetry, we added excerpts from Spectra, a book of poetic experiments, which was published in 1916 by Witter Binner and Arthur Davison Fick under the pseudonyms Emmanuel Morgan and Anne Knish. Spectra is a book of poetry built on the language of color, but more interestingly, it was intended by Binner and Fick as a satirical response to the imagism poetry movement, which they felt lacked substance. The Spectra poems were written as a hoax. This is still that same exhibition at CFPR. The Spectra poems were written as a hoax, attempting to make fun of the imagist's vibrant and nonsensical approach to writing poetry. But ironically, their Spectra poems became far more important to the history of poetry than anything the poets wrote with sincerity. So as artists, we just felt this footnote from literary history was a way to inject the presence of misinformation into our image-based work.
For us, the prints represent the haze of time as we try to understand our era through the memories of another generation. The closer we might get to understanding, the grayer and more confusing that space becomes. There was a time not so long ago when the newspaper, traditional printed media, was seen as a representation of the truth. Hence the quote that something is black and white. But the reality is that truth is slippery, and it always has been. With endless information at our fingertips, truth collides and blurs and becomes a middle gray, something complicated and dense and really hard to see. The presence of light in the form of EL wire, the neon, which appears in the second and third iteration of this series, you saw it in that slide before, kind of as a loose version of text, right? Writing out some of that poetry, housed within a plexiglass sheet. The EL wire, we're trying to use it as a way to struggle and come out of that grayness and to find a source of light or illumination in the work.
So this may be familiar to some of you. In 2019, we had this exhibition at the Print Center called Long Lost Friend. It was a totemic, or what we call a totemic archive of folk magic inspired matter. Approximated and inauthentic, various images and 3D scans of talismans and charms were meant to suggest a world of superstition that was removed from tradition. So an aestheticized staging that was part boutique and part library, meant to reference the past and the future. Long Lost Friend for us is a reflection on the mystical and a longing for tangible belief systems. The exhibition title comes from a 19th century book of spells and home remedies called Powwows or Long Lost Friend by John George Homan. The book addresses a range of superstitions regarding marriage and birth and day-to-day social interactions, but also includes cures for illness in cattle and other practical information that would have concerned a farming community for whom the book was written. The exhibition revolves around an archive of found and crafted objects, all meant to approximate meaningful totems, right? They're not actually meaningful, but we sort of were imbuing them with meaning. We used photography to document the objects on various green and orange backgrounds that were meant to isolate them from the real world, and honestly to create give them a sense of importance. We used print-on-demand services to make magazines / catalogs, and then we documented those as well. I got ahead of something here.
No,
anyway,
that's right.
Is it?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yeah, that's an image of the documentation of one of the catalogs.
Yeah.
UV printed on an aluminum plate.
Yeah. So all told, there are more than 500 images in the archive. While some objects occur more than once, the library of images continues to grow, and the database is fodder to be explored in myriad ways.
The overly saturated images of natural and handmade talismans begin to build a strange anthropological collection that occupies a space in the gallery alongside the real and the virtual. Wallpaper merges traditional cross-stitch patterns with 3D photogrammetry scanning grids and serves as a background for pseudo-anthropological images printed on aluminum and tabloid page spreads. The CNC routed plywood provides a framework for display, referencing a shaker style utility. I'll play that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so our shows are often accompanied by books or bibliographies as a way to kind of share our research. And in the fall of 2018, Lucky Risograph invited us to do a residency. And because we were already working on all the work for the Print Center show, it made sense to connect the two projects. So we produced this book called Water-Worn Bricks, Pie Stones, Chalk Rocks, and Smudge Sticks. And it was printed over the course of a few months while in residence with Lucky. It's essentially a handhold exhibition archive. And so while we use a lot of different print techniques throughout the show, like this is in some ways the most tangible print result from the body of work. It's also a standalone object. It doesn't need to be viewed in the context of the exhibition, but it was intended as a kind of field guide, cataloging some of the objects, but there was also graph paper included for notes and marginalia. So as we mentioned earlier, much of our recent work incorporates paper making. We started 2020 with this year-long residency at Dieudonné paper making, and then, but we actually began our experiments with them in the summer of 2019 as members of their community paper making studio. We started by learning basic techniques, approaches to sheet forming, pulp painting through stencils and wet collage. Conceptually, at the time, we were culling through books about color theory, aesthetics, optics, and poetry, and pairing it with these geological photographic images we were taking. We worked intuitively at first, building images on wet pulp that merged our various interests in color and geology. And we added these, we inserted color bars using linen pulp paint through stencils as a kind of provisional color key. As we worked amidst the colored vats of paper pulp and read text on color theory, and color mysticism, we came to realize we were generating our work through the lens of academia. So we felt like we were creating the beginning of a fictive academic course, which we started by calling Introduction to Geochromatic Studies. And all the resulting paperworks combined various rocks and books we'd been photographing. And our interest in geology started making appearances in the work as we sought to reference the physical origins of pigments and other studio materials, and began thinking about how time is compressed. For some context, that image on the right is from a 2014 exhibition we had in Montreal, where we bought a giant chunk of magnesite on eBay from a seller in Nevada, because the show was about some of the origins of the materials in the print shop we used to generate the rest of the work. So,
and magnesite is magnesium carbonate that
used
you would
in
use in lithography, right? So libraries for us are always a critical starting point, right? They provide inspiration and just they fundamentally get us where we need to go. They provide clues for our work, and they drive our work forward at various stages. In preparation for our work at Dieudonné, while we were going to be in residence, we arranged a trip up to New Haven to visit the world-renowned Faber-Barron collection of books on color at the Yale University Library. This collection houses noted scholar Faber-Barron's original library and has been supplemented over the years with all manner of different books on color. The slide on the right shows Faber-Barron himself setting up color experiments in the book, Color and Human Response. And on the left, you'll see an image from our visit from the Yale Library collection with the book, The Mysticism of Color from 1912, opened on a cradle for support. Reading through these texts is very important for us, but beyond that, sometimes we actually attempt to learn in more physical or tactile ways. Here you see an example of multiple attempts to bring books to life in the studio by actually completing reenactments and restaging and photographing those. On the left, you can see a contact sheet of attempts to capture the spirit of the image of Barron that you saw on the previous slide, and to use pedagogical language to frame this. We think of this as a kind of active learning, because here we're exploring and recontextualizing the history of color, a history that's been largely written by a single class and demographic.
Here's another example of a restaging. We took this anatomically questionable Munsell illustration where he was trying to describe a color relationship and decided to realize it in the flesh. So that's fingers with Leslie's hand with gouache on it with a laser cut reflective acrylic. I don't know, what would you call that?
It's just a mirror.
I know, but I feel like it needs it anyway. It's like more of an artifact or something. But it makes appearances in the work as well. So in January 2020, we installed intermediate geochromatic studies at the NARS Foundation in Brooklyn. The course or exhibit is basically a part of an open-ended inquiry into color and science, pseudoscience, and the spiritual. Large swaths of color akin to color pickers on digital screens were paired with with pigmented cotton paper and collage works, as well as risograph prints, photographs, and offset books, which sat on a circular plinth in the center of the space.
As part of a larger curricular sequence, the class explores both rational and irrational applications of color in the context of historical precedents and speculative interpretation. The circular plinth is designed magically to reflect color on the center of the room, taking the notion of color aura or immersive color therapy in a slightly different direction. Quote, the changing of bodies into light and light into bodies is very comfortable to the course of nature, which seems delighted with transmutations, end quote. This was written by Isaac Newton in Optics, or a treatise of the refractions, inflections, and colors of light that was written in 1704. We were reading a project about artist Ian Whittlesey that was conducted in 2017 called Becoming Invisible, where the artist posits that we can all become invisible if we can actually control the color around our being. He says, these exercises are intended to allow you to become invisible, but this does not, however, mean that you will physically disappear or dematerialize. Instead, you will be hidden from view, concealed within a cloud of your own creation. The cloud will be a gently glowing agglomeration of white light that surrounds you completely. Like the sun or a bare bulb, it will be visible, but unobservable, repelling the gaze of anyone who looks directly at it.
So Whittlesey is borrowing from the philosophy of Mazdaznan here. And Mazdaznan, if you don't know, is this cultish spiritual practice that stemmed from the writings of Dr. Ottoman Tsar Adusht Hanish in the 1960s. So interestingly, Johann Itten of the Bauhaus, pioneer of color theory, was also a follower of Mazdaznan. As perhaps another form of transcendental exercise, upon the plinths, it's a geochromatic library, which is a collection of books pairing the language of geological matter to the language of color codes. The books aren't meant to be read like a typical book, but instead are an investigation into the graphic qualities of letter and number forms, and are an exploration into the way in which hex code, which read out loud, or spoken over and over, could possibly, through like an approach to meditative practice, could transport us to another dimension of color space. We installed the show in January 2020, and we had started our year-long residency at Dieudonné, and we were generally feeling pretty good that we had some momentum and some really exciting things were in the pipeline.
And then COVID. As you may have heard, New York was hit hard and the lockdown was extreme. Our son was in online school. We were teaching online. I'm sure all of you were experiencing the same thing. We were essentially trapped in our 800 square foot apartment, and we did not have a studio at the time. Just to be clear, we are very lucky. We continue to be really lucky. We are one of the fortunate few that could have the kinds of jobs where we could stay at home. We could wait out the pandemic in a way that so many other people could not. That said, we were going through the same kind of stress that has been so familiar to most of us now. The notion of a meditative space became really critical for us in that year. We turned to making as a way to cope. I woke up one morning and remembered that my mother would have us make salt dough as a way to occupy our hands and to do something. Like it was an activity for us as kids. And so I took that recipe and I added high quality pigments that we had started to use in paper making, but no longer could use because we couldn't be at Dieudonné. And we started to make beads. Batch by small batch, we baked these in our kitchen oven with materials from our weekly massed trip to the grocery store. And unlike a lot of our work, this actually didn't begin with research or a plan. It was just a way, an activity, a thing to keep us all busy and to help us stay calm.
So the we in that is Leslie and me and our son. It was like a
joint
very
activity.
small artisanal factory.
We won't dwell on 2020 as we all have different stories to share. But so we're going to fast forward to 2021, where we had 3 different shows, each continuing this investigation into ideas about color and curriculum. And the beads that you saw that we worked on throughout that year when we were at home found their way into these exhibitions that are upcoming. We'll cycle through some slides that and the feature works within these shows as we wrap up the talk. The first, what you're looking at here, was a show at Delaware Contemporary. It was originally scheduled for mid-2020, and it was delayed like so many other things because of COVID. We arrived at the gallery in Wilmington in February, and after letting us in, the staff essentially just left us alone for the whole day to install the show. It was what I think is pretty normally an event where you get to meet people and have conversations and enjoy company. Was a really quiet, masked installation day for us in a gallery. The show features 2 altar-like structures. Either might be viewed as a triumphal arch or a tower. They could be seen as a portal or an all-seeing eye. Even further, they might be psychedelic manifestations or hallucinations, or even a spiritual presence. They are meant to be a space of possibilities. On the wall surrounding one of the altars is a few dozen of these beadworks. Each is a unique color story consisting of an arrangement of 108 handmade beads. The necklaces contain a variety of type and quantity of color, allowing for relational color contrasts to emerge. These are tools, these are artifacts, these are the result of a long pandemic year where our kitchen was our studio. We used humble everyday materials, salt, flour, oil, and pigment, and we mixed and we kneaded and we formed and we baked. And we did this over and over and over again. The beads are an analog wellness app that occupied our hands and distracted our minds. And we think of them as necklaces or even rosaries or maybe Japalamala.
Last summer, we ventured out of the city. We installed Geochromatic studies out of Gamut at Monaco in St. Louis, which is another city we have kind of a long history with. So it's nice to go back to St. Louis. Out of Gamut was a group of works considering digital and analog color gamuts and imagining a transitional space between them. The show was inspired by the quack color science of the late 19th century and reflects color's ability to straddle spaces, both real and imagined, and transport us to alternate places. The exhibition was anchored by a central printed image called Out of Gamut, Dark Rainbow. There was a large digitally printed grid spanning the wall and floor and engaging with objects and images both in and out of the color space. There are 2 planar works, Modified Boulders Rock Mold and Boulders Rock Mold in Verso, each operating as like a liminal panel alternating between the real and the possible. And then another freestanding grid appears as a 3-dimensional support structure for a piece we ultimately ended up calling Circles and Circles and Squares, Color Meditations, which is made of 30+ beaded meditation necklaces we created during the pandemic. They were woven through the metal wire grid, and the piece just leans against the wall like a composite figure, tired but sturdy, in and out of color.
In this work, which we titled Dark Psychic Forces, it's made of handmade paper, it's layered with mirrored acetate, and it's hanging on top of a digitally printed aura glow. Some of you might remember this phrase from the 2020 election cycle. Candidate Marianne Williamson, while framed as a figure from the fringe or as an outsider, was less afraid to use language in a more direct way than a traditional politician. Regardless of how she was received as a candidate, we recognize a guttural truth in the naming of something that many people felt at the time. Dark psychic forces had taken hold. This piece is included as a reminder that the things that we feel are not always imagined. And hanging near this piece in the gallery was Color and Practicum Analog Activities Sheet, which is a large-scale sticker pack, a fun, easy, less serious antidote to its sister work within the gallery space.
Gonna play,
Yeah.
So our most recent exhibition, which happened at the end of 2021, God, the years are all like blurring together, was called Color and Practicum, Mining Books on Color. And it took the form of an interactive installation at the Center for Book Arts in Manhattan. And it was also had a companion web project, which you can see here. I mean, like many of you, knowing this audience, during the pandemic, we found ourselves in this new educational world using digital platforms, trying to communicate tactile and physical information. And I think while delivering coursework virtually can be an exciting way to share content and create a multimedia classroom, it can come at the expense of greater distance and less direct connection between faculty and students. The Color and Practicum website is a way to process the online education that we experienced as artist educators. For the relatively few people who visited the exhibit in person, there were numerous QR codes integrated into the work that led them to the digital space, which again, you're seeing.
Here you see the course objectives as they relate to the impractical, right? It's a nod to pedagogy, but also written with a loftiness that may or may not be obtainable. More than just a practicum, which is a course emphasizing the practical aspects of a field of study, Color in Practicum is not bound by usefulness or applicability. Color in Practicum is an immersive and interactive digital experience of light, color, and its many traits. It is a laboratory and it is a playground. Through a series of interwoven prompts, we explore color and its visual, aesthetic, and conceptual effects. A video library and a reading list to meditate on a range of topics, ranging from traditional color theory to color in science and pseudoscience, as well as the spiritual. We'll post a link in the chat so you can all visit the website on your own time and explore. But here are a couple of screen captures that show you some of the various color exercises that you can partake in on the site. Unlike a traditional educational web resource, we approached knowledge sharing through a poetic and abstract lens. The idea is that through slow engagement, the user might gain proficiency in various course objectives. Some of the ideas and exercises are so abstract, in fact, that the descriptive language around them actually borders on the edge of poetry. Pedagogy can be this way too, we think, fuzzy, gray, open, borderless, and yet somehow binding.
So here is an example of a lecture component on the left. That's the lecture isn't actually moving, it's just a still shot of the website, but it's meant to provide instruction on how to use the prompt page on the right. They feature a hybrid card game that merges tarot fortune telling with an expanded deck of ESP symbol cards as developed by Carl Zener in the mid 20th century. Meant to posit an opening rather than a closing, the color cards are shuffled, placed, and read to divine momentum and possibility. Figures and forms of analog and digital origin adorn the polyglot deck. Engage with this covers, this crosses, this crowns to interpret what the cards may say to you. I'm just going to say that we made like a physical deck that exists in like an edition, but then there's a purely digital component. And for the website, we worked with a coder because we didn't have the necessary skills to bring the whole thing to completion on our own. So, yeah.
As we end our talk, we'd like to share with you a bibliography. Typically in our exhibitions, we'll share resources with an audience as a way to introduce them to the same content that we've been digesting. Perhaps this is an example, for instance, of the reader that you would have gotten if you had seen the show at NARS, for instance. When we were in Ireland, we built a reader for Babel Unbound. We tend to make these kind of ephemeral takeaways that are actually bibliographies. We hope that people will find something very different within the texts, or maybe they'll come to some of the same conclusions that we have. But we think of this way as working as ultimately collaborative and allowing each of our bodies of work to become kind of a mini sense, tying into the way in which we think about teaching as artists as well. So we'll post a link to both of those things in the chat here momentarily. We thank you so much for spending your time with us tonight, and we're looking forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Yeah. I hope that wasn't too long.
Oh, that was absolutely
Perfect.
Thank you so much for just sharing so much of your practice and just giving us a little like peep into some of the work that you're looking at. So we really appreciate that a lot.
Zach! Sorry, I have to say hi to Zach.
The kids must be asleep.
No.
Also with their electronic babysitter.
Excellent, excellent.
Yeah, we wanted to open up this time to ask questions. I'm going to start off with a couple, but because we don't have a whole lot of time left, if anyone wants to piggyback off of something that I said, please feel free to just jump in. Yeah, I don't want to take you too far back in some of the things that you talked about. You definitely talked about your relationship as collaborators in the beginning, which I thought was really interesting to hear. But I guess I was also curious a little bit further about how collaboration enhances and shapes your practice. Like, have you guys developed like a strategy in incorporating each other's ideas? Like, I can imagine it's a lot of conversation and back and forth, but what does that necessarily look like for the two of you?
I wish that I could give you one answer that would make it seem as though we figured it out, but we really haven't. I think depending upon the project, it changes. And it's changed over, we've been collaborating now since 2012. So almost 10 years.
Yeah.
And I think the way in which we work together, it's in response to whatever is kind of impacting our day-to-day lives, right? We're both teachers, we are married, we have a child. And so I think it's all about a balancing act and trying to figure out how to handle the workload amongst ourselves. I mean, I think there are things that we have natural proclivities and like interests in that we will pick up within a project and work on and then bounce back and forth. But I think it's a constant negotiation. Let's say that
but I mean, I think there's also, like that rule of improvisation where you like have to say yes.
You do have to say yes.
Like you don't like stop someone's idea in their tracks.
And there are no bad ideas in brainstorming.
Yeah. So like, I think a lot of
even though there are a lot of bad ideas in brainstorming.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it's just sort of like being enthusiastic there are definitely we've definitely invested like a lot of time in projects that ultimately were like, oh, this was all just like a huge waste of time to get us to this other idea. But yeah, I think I don't know. I mean, I think, we're both pretty amenable to each other's ideas, but then there is a point at which like decisions have to be made. And I think both of us have, been the one who said, okay, stop, like this is enough. We need to stop here. This project's finished. But I think it's always changing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes total sense. Thank you for sharing that. Before I delve into another question, does anyone else have a question they'd like to ask? Sweet. Okay. I just like throughout the entire presentation, just the colors are so grabbing, and I'm just like really floored by how many different colors that you use and using them in physical sense and also in a digital sense. And I was really, and you definitely referenced a lot of some of like the works that you were looking at that inform the colors that you choose. But I was like wondering, like, where does the decision process of the colors come from? Like, do you do that digitally first and do like tests like on a digital platform? Is it you know, in real life you choose out those colors, or kind of how does it come to you?
So a lot of this, the paper making, like the colors that you see, like one, you're not even really seeing the full color because this is like all fluorescent, the yellow and the pink. We literally like started using that palette because we had this plan to incorporate these different lights into the project. And these were the colors that were most reactive to the lights. And then ultimately, again, speaking of things that haven't really happened, like we haven't found a way to successfully use the lights at this point. We've like sunk time and money into this technology that's sort of sitting in our studio still and hasn't really worked out, but it's had this profound effect on all of this paper making work and sort of the color so that's coming from a really specific place. There's a kind of constraint that ultimately we probably didn't need now, but
yeah. And I think, you know, I think my love of color, which then becomes our love of color because everything is shared.
mm-hmm.
He says quietly.
Yeah.
You know, when we were at UT, as we were leaving, I think maybe within the last 2 years there, I was working with a colleague to develop a course at UT called The New Color. And it was a focus on, you know, bringing kind of color and aesthetics to the whole of the university, right? Like a 52,000 student institution, where it would benefit biology majors to think about color, where it would benefit mathematicians to think about color, right? So we were trying to think about color from a varied kind of vantage point and bringing in a bunch of different experts from a bunch of different fields to talk about color from their perspectives. And it was the first time in a long time that something got me really excited in education. And I've been teaching in foundation for a long time. I think I'm on year 18 at this point. And color is a big part of what we teach at the foundational level. So it's something that I've always thought about. And, you know, as most of us have been taught, we know Albers, we know Itten, and really that's it. Like there might be a little Munsell in there, and maybe there's like a little something else, but we don't scratch the surface of what color really is. And so leaving UT, coming here, starting at Pratt, focusing, you know, taking a position as chair at foundation and really kind of hunkering down and thinking about color. We also teach a extensive color course here at Pratt, like color and design. It's a year-long foundational course in color but it focuses on light in a way that I haven't seen other foundational courses focus on light and color. I think for me, it sparked a bunch of really interesting reading and thinking about color. And I think it became conversational between us and then kind of slowly worked its way into our work, like took hold of the way that we were thinking about.
Yeah, it wasn't immediate.
No, it wasn't immediate.
I mean, honestly, we did a lot of stuff that was just like classic printmaker, CMYK kind of stuff. And then it just started to get like much more complex. But like our digital printers, you know, we've got like a large format Epson that has like CMYK plus like light CMYK. So it's got a bit of a range, but there's limits to what we can do color wise with our particular printer. That if we were to upgrade, a very expensive upgrade, like we could have push it even further. But yeah, I think the color space is a little different with digital because there's so little restraint to what you do. But the other thing is I was going to say that a lot of the color choices we were doing a lot of research just on like colors related to geology, you know, so there's a lot of colors that, you know, citrine or, you know, anyway, there's any number of like color names that correlate with geography or geology.
Well, and pigments that come from
you
know, minerals. So
right. So it sounds like, it just depends on like the framework that you're working with.
It really does.
Yeah, which is awesome. We have a couple minutes left, so I definitely wanted to open it up to anyone else who has a question for Jason and Leslie right now.
Evan wants to know if I've forgotten how to etch.
He has, Evan.
No, I haven't. I haven't.
haven't
didn't
seen
say
I
that.
haven't seen you make an etching in a
You know what?
really
Hey,
long time.
I was teaching an etching class at Purchase when the pandemic hit. I was like on the
Really?
verge of
Okay.
like making my own etching secretly. And
That's why we had to
And then I
leave
got shut
UT. He
down.
had access to a print shop and he could continue to make prints. So we had to leave so that he has no access,
yeah,
but he can still make etchings.
yeah.
I don't think you forget that kind of thing.
That's it, right? Maybe sadly, but yeah, no, it's in you.
You can't get away from it.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. That's what I'm going to do when I retire. I'm just going to make etchings.
Not the worst way to retire.
Hey,
And,
I'm seeing your
you know-
Instagram account, Evan. I know. It's like beer and prints.
Again, there's worse ways to retire.
Awesome.
But it is, I want to say that after all this time, it's really great to see what you're doing now, to get kind of this overview of your newer work and just to see the progress you've made since you were here at Kutztown.
Thanks, Evan.
No.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, if there are no other questions, this has been an amazing talk. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I really loved it. So thank you. And if you want to stay on a little bit after and chat, that's totally fine. But I'd welcome everyone to commence or to end the talk. And thank you for coming for another installation of Virtual Studio Visits.
Happy to do it.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, we're so amazed at what Zach and Jen have built. I
Yep.
mean, such a cool thing. It's awesome. So
It really is. It
Happy to be
really
here.
is.
we'll have to visit in person soon.
Yes.
And you all are not far away. So if anybody is in the city and wants a studio visit for real, hit us up.
While
While
we
we
have
have a
one.
studio, we'd be happy to show you.
I'll be back up.
I'm definitely going to do that.
Please.
It's nice seeing you all. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Really great seeing you guys too.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Joanna, will you stop the recording?
Yes.
Bye.
Bye, Pearl.
Bye.